So I try to explain it this way. The genius of Muhammad is that he took the embedded tribal mores of his society, 7th century Arabia, which was immensely tribalistic, and he basically re-articulated it through a theological paradigm. He added to it divine rewards. So now not only are you, again, justified in attacking, killing, enslaving the other, in this case the non-Muslim, but if you die in this process, then you even get more benefits and more rewards in paradise. So it became, for the 7th century mentality, a very compelling ideology. He got a lot of followers, and with every victory, his numbers grew, and they joined the bandwagon because he told his followers, enmity and hatred will reign between us forever until you believe in Allah alone. It's an appropriating religion. It takes these biblical figures because it had to. In the 7th century, if you wanted to form a religion, you better be in the footsteps of everyone from Adam to Jesus, because that's what the Middle East was all about.
Truth Report. Special guest today. He happens to be in Budapest at the moment, and his name is Raymond Ibrahim. And Raymond is an American author, a number of books, The Sword and the Scimitar, you may know of. He's a translator, speaks fluent Arabic, fluent English, I believe. We'll find out. And he's a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute, which I guess he's at right now. And his focus is Arabic history and language and current events. What I'd love to do, if you don't mind, is kind of Islam 101, a kind of story of where it came from and how it sits with Judaism, Christianity in the world. If you could just give us the basics and the expansion of it and what it stands for. You know, there was an incredible Oxford Union debate this last week, quite a heated one. And the topic was, the House believes that the West has a right to be suspicious of Islam. And there was a debate of 3 on one side, 3 on the other side. I think they actually did debate 2 different days with visiting debaters. And it was really about why people are suspicious of Islam. What is it about Islam that we as Christians or Jews don't get? What are we missing? And if you're happy to talk about that, what I'd like to do is talk about radical Islam and the threat that that poses, where it sits, radical Islam in the world of Islam. Does Islam have within it the seeds of its own destruction? I doubt you've been asked that, but it's something that I've pondered. And also, is Islam a religion of peace? Big topics.
Yeah.
Maybe start at the beginning.
I always think if you want to understand what Islam is, or really any religion or ideology, the best way is to look both at its doctrines and then also look at its history, and then see if there's patterns and continuities that trace to the modern era today. And if you can trace those 3, I think that you can make an ironclad case. This is what that religion's about. Of course, the doctrines of Islam are many and multifaceted, and I'm not that kind of guy, by the way. There's a lot of them who just feel like Islam is inherently evil and everything about it is horrible. I'm mostly interested in those aspects of Islam that affect me as a non-Muslim. That's it. What Muslims do amongst each other, that's their affair. If they want to enforce Sharia on each other, draconian punishments, it's fine by me. Okay, I'm mostly interested in what it has to say about us, non-Muslims. So that's why I'm going to summarize that part. I try to explain it this way. The genius of Muhammad is that he took the embedded tribal mores of his society, 7th century Arabia, which was immensely tribalistic, and he basically re-articulated it through a theological paradigm. So tribalism, of course, is us, the tribe. It's a blood tribe historically against everyone else, right? And if you understand what tribalism is, it meant anyone else is basically free game. I can kill, enslave, rape, whatever, because they're not humans, okay? The only ones who are real are us, the tribe. And that's how it was in Arabia and other tribal societies as well. So he took that mentality and gave it a theological veneer. So now the tribe was no longer necessarily the blood kin, but it was the people who followed his message, Muslims, the people who submit to Islam. And everyone else became the outside tribe. Okay, and in Arabic, they have many names, kuffar, usually it's translated as infidels, mushrikeen, polytheists, etc., etc. And they all carry very negative pejoratives, these terms, okay? So that was it. And but now he added to it on top of this, on top of historic tribalism, he added to it divine rewards. So now not only are you, again, justified in attacking, killing, enslaving the other, in this case, the non-Muslim, but if you die in this process, then you even get more benefits and more rewards in paradise. Okay. So it became, for the 7th century mentality, a very compelling ideology. And he got a lot of followers. And with every victory, his numbers grew and they joined the bandwagon and so forth. Okay. So, and what I've just described, because I was telling you the doctrine, so this actually is a literal doctrine. In Arabic, it's in the Quran, for example, and in Arabic, it's known as al-wala wal-bara, which can be translated. These are two words, and they're basically dichotomized words, and they could be, I used to always translate them as loyalty, wala, and bara is enmity. But I've seen Muslims more recently translate it, and I think it's pretty accurate, into love and hate. And in a long story short, it's love, loyalty for Allah and the Muslims, and it's hate and enmity and disloyalty to all the non-Muslims. Okay, and this is in the Quran. You can look at, for example, the pivotal verse is Quran 64, or Surah 60, verse 4, which calls on the believers. It says, "You have an example in Ibrahim," my namesake, which would be, of course, the patriarch Abraham, but that's how it's transliterated in Arabic, because he told his followers, "Enmity and hatred will reign between us forever until you believe in Allah alone." Okay, so it's the Abraham story from Genesis. But now, of course, as usual, Islam appropriates biblical characters and figures and twists them around.
It is an Abrahamic religion.
It depends on what one means. It's an appropriating religion. It takes these biblical figures because it had to. In the 7th century, if you wanted to form a religion, you better be in the footsteps of everyone from Adam to Jesus, because that's what the Middle East was all about, whether it was Jewish or Christian. So you can't come up with some brand new alien thing. So it basically appropriated all that. And this is actually an interesting topic, which we should actually just discuss on its own. But I'll just finalize what I'm saying. So, okay, so there's the hatred and the enmity for the non-Muslim, tribalism. Okay, now this is supposed to be in the heart. The Quran tells Muslims, you must have this in your heart. There's verses that even says, Quran 328 tells Muslims, yes, do not befriend, do not be close to the infidels. The other Quran verses names the infidels as Christians and Jews. And it says, do not befriend them unless you need to, basically as a stratagem. Okay, you need to feign friendship because they have power over you. That's actually in the Quran, and that's even in the words within that verse 328 is where we get the doctrine of taqiyya, and that's a whole other thing, which is where Muslims are. It's legitimate for Muslims to actively deceive non-Muslims, behave like their friends, etc., etc. Okay, but now this hatred, this enmity, this disloyalty for non-Muslims and loyalty for Islam manifests itself historically as a jihad. Okay, which just means struggle. That's true, but in the context of our discussion, theologically, it meant, well, what Orientalists translated it is pretty fair: holy war on behalf of empowering Islam and the Islamic community, the Ummah. Okay, so that's how you expressed this loyalty and enmity. So the one is metaphysical, loyalty and enmity, and the one is physical, jihad. And then the last one, I'm giving you the three major doctrines that are problematic for non-Muslims. The last one is, once you do conquer a non-Muslim territory, though everyone underneath you now, the non-Muslims, they have really three choices. You either convert to Islam, or you pay tribute. It's called jizya, and this is based on Quran 929, which says, fight the people of the book. This would be specifically Christians and Jews, until they either convert, pay tribute, and feel themselves subdued, meaning they have to embrace second or even third class status in an Islamic state, or they fight to the death. Okay, so now so if you look at the Islamic world, what we call it, most of those are people whose ancestors were coerced into converting to Islam because it was the easy way out. And you still see small pockets of, let's say, Christians in Egypt and the Middle East. So those are the remnants of the people who did pay tribute until it was actually abolished in the colonial era, because the colonial powers forced them in the 19th century, forced basically these Arab Muslim nations to abolish the dhimmi status. But the point is, you can't, after an Islamic power comes into authority, you as a non-Muslim you have to embrace second class status at best. So those are the three fundamental doctrinal problems, I think. The disloyalty, enmity for non-Muslims, which manifests as constant war whenever convenient, whenever circumstances allow, and sometimes they don't. And Muslims have doctrines for that too. They can have truces. Like I said, they can pretend to be on good terms, but then when the circumstance changes, then yes, the jihad comes back. And finally, those who are conquered, there's no way, shape, or form that they have any kind of equality. And we see this till this very day, even though the constitutions of nations like Egypt and Syria and Pakistan will say there is no religious discrimination, Christians and Muslims and Jews are all equal, et cetera, et cetera. In practice, that is not the case at all. Whether it's the people or the government or the police or the judges, they all treat it based on Islamic law or Sharia, which is, yeah, you're a second-class citizen. So those are the three, and I'll take a little break in case you have any questions, and then I'll show you the historical components of those doctrines.
And how does the concept of an apostate come into this? You know, you've been subdued, you take on the religion, you decide it's not a great religion, you want to leave. That's not a good thing, is it?
Yeah, so again, I was really distilling it to the three most important from a non-Muslim point of view, but of course, there are many things within Islam that are problematic. One is this, apostasy. One is blasphemy. Okay, you can't speak or even be perceived as speaking against Islam. And apostasy, of course, is the troubling fact that in Islam, you are a Muslim if you're born to a Muslim father. There's no baptism rites or any you're just a Muslim because your father was a Muslim. And if you try to leave the religion, you're an apostate. And again, according to the Islamic Sharia law, you get punished, including up to death and execution. Okay, so yeah, there's definitely lots of other problems within Islam. There's, you know, how women are treated, for example, by modern standards. It would be considered, of course, misogynistic. They get half the rights of men oftentimes, depending on the situation. So there's a lot more to unpack about Islam per se and its problematic ways. But what I just gave you is, the bare bones summary of the doctrines that create hostility and conflict between non-Muslims.
There is a concept. A land has been conquered by Islam, then it's retaken. Let's take Spain as an example. That remains, in their eyes, a land of Islam, isn't it?
Yeah, Spain is occupied territory for Muslims. And the more popular, of course, example is Israel. But yeah, even Spain and Balkans, the Balkan regions, because they were under Ottoman control for sometimes centuries. Where I'm at right now, Budapest, this was conquered. So technically, this is a waqf, which means, yes, this is once and for all Islamic territory. It just happens to be under, infidel occupation for the time being.
And how did it spread so fast? I mean, how did that happen? Was it was the weakness on the side of Christianity in Europe? Was it a combination of the two?
So that's a good segue to get into the history, which I often say is basically a manifestation of the doctrine. So, so now Muhammad dies in 632, and he's more or less consolidated much of Arabia, and then following him, the first caliph, and caliph just means successor. And a caliph is a political religious figure, which again underscores that if the successors of Muhammad are political figures, that means Muhammad, the prophet, was a political figure. That's very interesting. This is something that many Western mentalities, especially Christian minds, don't grasp, because to them, to be religious is to somehow be otherworldly and, concerned with spiritual matters, nothing in the here and now. But that's more or less a distinctly, you can argue, Christian, Buddhist kind of idea. It's far from Islam. Okay, Islam is about the now, what you do physically in the here. It's about policies and politics. So anyway, the first caliph consolidates Arabia, dies by 634. And then what we can call the jihad begins in earnest against non-Arab, outside of the Arabian Peninsula. And what do you have there? Well, you have Christianity everywhere, primarily. It's now the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium. It's all over the Middle East. It's because, as we know, Egypt and Syria, these were parts of Rome for the longest time. And they were Hellenized even before that under the Greeks. So you have the Roman Empire, the Byzantines in Egypt, and Greater Syria. Greater Syria would have encompassed all those modern-day countries today, like Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, etc. And Asia Minor, what we call Turkey, of course, was another bastion of Christianity. And east of that, of course, you have the Persian Empire, the Sasanians. And so the Arabs begin, and long story short, that's actually the topics that I write about. If anyone's really interested in getting more on what I'm going to discuss, it's in my book, Sword and Scimitar. The subtitle is 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and West. So I methodically go through this, and I'm giving you, of course, the Blitz version right now. Long story short, from 632 to 732, that's 1 century. Basically, 2/3 of what was once the Christian world is permanently conquered by Islam. And that is those regions I discussed, which is Egypt. Again, people find this hard to understand, but Egypt and Syria and Asia Minor and North Africa were more Christian than Europe at this time. This has to do with that sort of historical amnesia we're dealing with. But when you talk about North Africa, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, immediately everyone thinks, okay, either Islamic, and those who are a little smarter think, well, it was at least Oriental at some point, if not. But it was squarely part of the Christian tradition. It was Hellenized. It was like, this is why the Roman emperor moved the capital from Rome to the east, Constantinople, because that's where everything was. All right. So anyway, so I'm trying to like give you the backdrop. This is a very highly Christian area. If you want to talk about the ecclesiastical councils, the early church fathers, they're all the majority of them are in Egypt and Syria and North Africa. Augustine, the great, Western theologian of Hippo, was a Berber from Algeria. Okay. So anyway, all of this is conquered in 1 century, all of North Africa. So the Middle East entirely is conquered, Egypt all the way to Morocco. And then, and I find this interesting because it touches on current events, from Ceuta, that little enclave, which gets conquered in 709, that's where the launch into Spain happens in 711. And then Spain is conquered by Muslims. So in a way, for me, or for anyone who really appreciates history, what we're seeing now is sort of like a repeat of history, and people don't get it. And then Spain is conquered in 711. And the vast majority of it, there's a small hold-up remnant in the northwest quadrant, whence the Reconquista begins and takes centuries to finally evict Islam out. But I gave you the year 732 from 632, Muhammad's death, because that's the Battle of Tours. And now Muslims are in the middle of France, okay? And the same sorts of things, the attacks and the violence and the desecration of churches and the massacres and the enslavement is going on apace all this time. And they're finally stopped there. So in 1 century, that's what happened, and that's the massive conquest. Now, the great question which you asked is, well, how was that realized in the first place? And historians have, for the longest times, it's really a thorny question because it's not easy to explain. The Arabs were historically seen as very weak, just these Bedouins who are, poorly clad, no armor, no, they're not contenders of the Sasanian Persian Empire or the Byzantines, right? And somehow in 1 century, all this happens and they fall like dominoes. And there's all sorts of theories from the desiccation of Arabia. One of the more popular one is that the Romans and the Persians had been fighting for many years, and they had right before Islam. So they were both militarily exhausted at this point, and they were easy pickings. That's the most popular theory. The Christian theories are very interesting, I find, because they also have certain parallels with today. And it's basically that, no, it's because Christians, this might be a detour for later. I don't want to we can talk about that. It's interesting. But anyway, so all of that is conquered. And that's just the first phase, right? And then the second, you have different iterations. And then another primary one is the rise of the Turks. So now the Turks start coming in from the steppes of Asia. They become Islamized. Many of them actually were imported as slave soldiers, because they were good fighters. The Arabs, the Abbasid Caliphate especially, brought them in and Islamized them. But before long, they become masters. They actually rule the Abbasid Caliphate. They'd keep a caliph as a puppet. But they really sink their teeth into jihad. And so many historians have observed that they actually took to jihad more than the Arabs. And again, this underscores because they are nomadic tribal peoples. And so jihad and the doctrines that I had mentioned of tribalism completely jibe with their pre-existing mores. And it's funny, in Sword and Scimitar, I have a little part where I talk about the pre-Islamic Turks and their oral sagas. And it's almost identical to how they sound when they become Muslim. The only difference is now you have a religious element. Allah's in it, the word jihad is in it, but it's still about, I killed the priest, I took the girl, I burned the church. And it was like that before. But now it's pious, and now I'm a good Muslim, okay? And I'm going to heaven for it. So this is why these tribal groups, the Mongols, a lot of them also eventually known as the Tatars, became Islamic as well. And for example, the Golden Horde, which the Tatar yoke that Orthodox Russia suffered from, was Muslim. And you see the same articulation of Islamic discrimination against infidels, Christians, etc. I don't want to get too lost in the history, but with the Seljuks, this is what gave rise to the First Crusade, because they began a whole new wave of atrocities in the Holy Land against pilgrims. They just in Armenia alone, they destroyed thousands of churches and enslaved tens of thousands of Christians, slaughtered the Greeks as well. And after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, they're right there across the Bosporus, right by Constantinople, preparing to invade. And that's why you get the First Crusade, of course. We can talk about the Crusade if you want at some point, but then I'm just trying to give you the conquests. And then you get the Ottomans, which is another Turkish iteration, even more violent than the Seljuks. And they're the ones who really start spearheading into Europe, and they conquer the Balkans. And by 1683, so now we're talking 1,000 years after the death of Muhammad. I told you the first century, now it's 1,000 years, and they're at Vienna in 1683. Okay, so think of all the territory that had been permanently conquered, that was Christian, all of North Africa and the Middle East and Asia Minor, and Spain, even though that got liberated eventually, though not for long, and then the Balkans, all the way up to Vienna, right? And this is to say nothing of the slave raids that went on. For example, in North Africa, you had what's known as the Barbary states, and they launched nonstop. The Mediterranean was awash with slave raids, especially against Spain, Italy, southern France. But they went as far as Iceland and raided and brought back slaves from Iceland. They had an island that they used as a base off England, Lundy, where they also for years terrorized and would raid England and take slaves back to North Africa.
Can I ask a stupid question? Two, Vlad the Impaler comes into the story at some point. Those were my childhood. And then secondly, how did Islam spread to the East? How did it get to Indonesia and Malaysia and places like that? That I don't actually know. So that's new for me.
So it's to answer your second question, it's the same story. It's jihad. Historians they like to say that they'll use places like Indonesia and maybe some areas of sub-Saharan Africa as having been proselytized peacefully, though there's a lot of contention about that. But nobody disputes that the areas that I mentioned, okay, North Africa, Europe, Iran, India, the jihad against India was even more brutal than what I just discussed. Okay, so according to one well-known Indian historian, something like, the number is just astronomical, like 500 million Hindus were killed. It's so absurd. I've said it before, or something like at least 100 million, okay, in 5 centuries in the name of jihad, all right? And then further on east, all these regions, Afghanistan, but Indonesia, I don't know. Supposedly at that point it had, the jihad has sort of trickled out, and maybe it became through trade, though I'm suspicious of that. But even if it is, what we're saying is the overwhelming majority of what we call the Islamic world, especially the heart of it, the Middle East, North Africa, MENA, was taken by violence and bloodshed. Okay, so that's an incontestable fact. As for Vlad, Vlad the Impaler, well, I think now that I've given a brief sort of summation of what Europe was facing, you can begin to understand why figures like Vlad came into being in the first place. Okay, because in fact, so Vlad was, first of all, he was given as a hostage to the Ottoman Turks, him and his brother when they were kids, and they were both abused. His brother was turned into the Sultan's catamite, basically a sex slave, homosexual sex slave. He eventually broke free and became the Prince of Wallachia, or modern-day Romania, southern Romania. And what he did then is all the stuff we know about him, the impalement, he was basically fighting fire with fire. The impalement, the Turks were doing that. He learned that when he was their hostage, okay? And because he was a much smaller and weaker force compared to the Ottomans was like a behemoth war machine compared to any European power, especially Vlad. The Wallachians were, the sources talk about 150,000 Ottomans against 30,000 poorly armed Wallachians, okay? So they had to engage in basically guerrilla warfare and terrorism, terror tactics. So that's where the impalement comes from, and it would work oftentimes. At one point, the Sultan came and surrounded Vlad's palace in Turgevishte, and around it he saw what he thought was, or he hoped wasn't real, the forest of the impaled, which was supposed to be tens of thousands of Ottomans from previous years impaled on stakes. Okay, a very ghastly sight, I'm sure, not to mention the stench. And it was enough, of course, to cause the Sultan to just leave and flee. So, and anyway, this is what I always find interesting. There's a lot of brutal figures from European history, like Vlad, but you're never given the context of how they rose in the first place. Or like Ivan the Terrible. Yeah, he was pretty terrible, but no one really knows he was at war with Muslims, the Tatars, and the Crimean Khanate, and why that brought out, such a fierce sort of resolve that was needed to maintain any kind. If you want to beat these guys, you have to get really serious.
You know what interested me, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, is I think what's called stealth jihad, if that's right. And what you mentioned was, you are allowed to conceal your true intentions in order to, over time, gain a position of power. So in other words, if Islam is not the dominant force in an area, you can then pretend good faith until the time comes when you can actually take over. And that's interesting because if you look in Christianity, and I believe you were born a Copt, is that right? A Coptic Christian from Egypt. What percentage of Egypt is still Copt? Is it 5-10%, something like that?
The government will never give a true figure, but it's estimated based on things like baptismal records that it's at least 10% and as much as maybe 15%.
When you look at stealth jihad, when you look at the ability of concealing your intentions until you can get the upper hand, and which is an issue of, is there any good faith? And then you have Christianity, pray for your killers, turn the other cheek, may the meek inherit the earth. I go on and on and on. You're dealing with another religion, I won't say adversary, but another religion that's operating on a completely different level. And it's a level of conquest. It's a level of invasion and conquest. Because if every land that they have invaded and conquered at some point in the history of Islam is considered Islam's land, this isn't finite, is it? It's infinite. It has within it an infinite sense of we plan to take over, we will take over, and we'll use any methods necessary.
This is literally part of Islam's DNA, okay? If we want to be honest, this is part of, like you said, Christianity has various teachings. Well, this is one of the teachings that Islam, and it's seen as a good thing. This is altruism, okay? If ISIS is beheading infidels and burning them and crucifying them, well, that's a good thing because they're spreading Islamic law and Islamic governance, which is great because that's God's law, Allah's law. So you have to understand, from a Muslim's point of view, they don't see themselves as the bad guys, even when they're engaged in atrocities. They see themselves as the good guys. And but yes, this is the ultimate vision of Islam, which is to govern the entire globe. Like I said, it's very much a political movement in the guise of a religion. And the problem is, I would argue, the sort of Christianity that you explain, you just kind of summarized, which I agree with, is the popular form. It wasn't like that before. So in pre-modern Christianity, it understood what Islam was. Okay, so you were mentioning stealth jihad, and I'll get to that, but stealth jihad basically is this idea that, like I said, jihad, the word itself in Arabic, simply means to struggle and strive on behalf of Islam. It doesn't have to be warfare, okay? And so today it is happening in the West, and they have all sorts of names in Arabic terminology. But to summarize, there's the pen jihad, there's the propaganda jihad, the tongue jihad. These all deal with various forms of deception and propaganda, okay? Undermining Western morale, whitewashing Islam, whatever the case may be. There's financial jihad, where you're a rich Saudi and you just support jihadists. There's the most famous and probably the one that's going to be, the final nail on the West's coffin, the baby jihad, which is the demographic jihad, whereby Muslim families, especially women, are encouraged to have as many children as possible. And we see that happening as well, especially in Africa, but also in Europe, which is amazing. So here's the thing, though. None of those forms of jihad could have worked in the pre-modern Christian era because Christians were not naive. Okay, so the only form of jihad that did work against them was armed holy warfare, violence and war, because that was the only way you're going to break in.
And Raymond, I remember singing hymns at school. I went to an Anglican school. Onward, Christian soldiers. Onward, Christian soldiers. That was muscular Christianity, wasn't it? And have we lost that? Does that still exist?
Well, to me, that is the ultimate issue right now. In fact, I would argue that the Islam problem is a symptom of that. Remember, Islam is inherently weak in the modern era. It is nowhere near as powerful as the West technologically, militarily, economically, and yet it's a problem, right? Why is that? Because the West, despite having material power, has lost all sorts of spiritual power. Has no morale anymore, nothing to fight for, nothing to defend, right? As opposed to their ancestors. So the Europeans that we were talking about, from Vlad the Impaler, and that's my other book, Defenders of the West. I speak about these various characters. That was Europe at a time when it was weak compared to, like I said, the Ottoman Empire. So Europe was the weak side, but they did everything. They fought till they died, including kings and emperors, to preserve their way of life, their culture, their faith, their religion, their families. Today, unfortunately, it's, I don't know. A lot of Western people don't seem interested in preserving any of those things, maybe because they don't even have them. So that's definitely one of the biggest issues. And this is why I often say Islam and what we're seeing is a direct symptom or byproduct of Western decline. It's not Islam inherently strong. But as far as muscular Christianity, I was just thinking on this today, and I was working on an article, and I'll give you a perfect example. The World Cup recently, there was a commercial, and it's by supposedly a Christian organization. I think they're called He Gets Us. And the commercial is called Lose. And it starts talking about, why don't you lose sometime? And the first image is an athlete, like an athlete's supposed to lose. That's the Christian virtue. And then it literally even says, you even hear the man say, why don't you lose the argument intentionally? And so this is now, so Christianity has been weaponized to destroy itself and make itself lose, right? And of course, it's very sneaky how this commercial is, because much of its sentiment is accurate. Yes, winning is not everything. I agree. There's a lot more important things than winning. But to tell someone in athletics, hey, why don't you lose? Or to tell someone, why don't you intentionally lose the argument? Which is to say, why don't you actually forfeit the truth and let lies actually overcome what you're saying? This is not in any way, shape, or form Christian. Okay, that's not what Jesus did. He argued with his opponents. He argued and beat Satan, okay, in the desert. He didn't say, okay, I'm going to let you win intentionally. I'm going to lose. So it's this loser mentality and before that, the same group, He Gets Us. I saw in 2024, the Super Bowl, they had another commercial, which was called Wash. Okay, it just shows images, and every image is someone washing someone's feet. Okay, seems innocuous enough. But then you start seeing a kind of pattern whereby everyone who's washing feet on their hands and knees kind of look like white, traditional Christian Americans. And everyone getting their feet washed are the exact opposite. So there's a woman in a hijab. There's like a migrant woman who crossed over illegally, apparently, and she's angry and she's getting her foot washed. There's a priest washing the foot of a trans person. So, it becomes obvious that this isn't about tolerance or love and mercy. It's about capitulating to what is wrong and intentionally losing. And so many Christians, unfortunately, think that's their religion begins and ends with this idea.
Wow. You've nailed it. I mean, when we look at all of these elements that you've raised, fundamental elements, tenets of the religion, it strikes me as the religion has within it the seeds of its own destruction. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. You have to believe that the majority of humanity want a better life for their families and for themselves. And a better life, it can't be a subservient woman. A better life can't be education that doesn't open people's minds. A better life can't be, holding something back that has a natural inclination to go forward. And it strikes me that Islam has many of those negative tenets in its religion, whereas humanity isn't designed like that at all. Or I'm reading it wrong. And if I am right, then, Islam will collapse under its own weight. It's almost like the Democrats in America it's a race to the bottom. Christianity was strong, then Islam was strong, then Christianity regained the strength. Now in the world, it's maybe 50-50 or 60-40 on Islam's favor, as there's Islamification of Africa. as there's the, as you call it, the, what's it called? The children jihad,
Baby jihad.
baby jihad. But, you know, there has to be a point, in my view, where enough Muslims say, this thing is spiraling, this is a race to the bottom. The Islamists are taking over. The bad guys have taken our religion, which we think is a good religion, science, religion of science and love and compassion, and they're interpreting it in the wrong way. You know, we're out. Now, that's not today. It's certainly not tomorrow, but it has to be at some point in the future. No empires last forever.
You know, my take on it is similar, but also slightly different. And so let's backtrack a little bit and talk about, because I think what you're saying is that, you know, all people want to, it's not just about material advancement. You also want to unshackle yourself, right? And become freer and happier, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously under its own weight, Islam must be doomed. Okay. So here's my observation. This wasn't always the case. There was actually a time when Islam was doing what you're saying people will do. And this was during the colonial era. So after Europe basically invades and conquers and colonizes many Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries like India, what you find isn't what you would think, which is that, oh, Muslims are outraged and they're all screaming and foaming at the mouth saying jihad, we got to get rid of these people. You find something very different. You find them actually trying to assimilate and trying to act like they're colonizers, okay? So if you look at, you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, if you look at pictures of Egypt, let's say, okay, which I have, let's say in the early 1900s, 1920s, all the men are in suits and ties. All the women are in dresses, no hijabs, no head veils. It looks like you're looking at Europe, okay? It's very interesting. You don't see what you see today. And I'm going to explain why this has changed. So what happened, and the best example you can get is the Ottoman Empire. As I had mentioned, the Ottomans were basically the scourge of Europe, and they were the standard bearers of jihad more than any other predecessors. And lo and behold, during the colonial era, you get Ataturk, okay, and he basically, he all but bans Islam, okay? He gets rid of the Arabic script. Turkish was written with an Arabic script. He adopts the Roman alphabet. He basically coerces everyone to start shaving and dressing like Europeans. He does all sorts of things.
Get rid of the fez.
The fez, yeah, basically Europe, and this is the Ottoman Empire or the heirs of the Ottoman Empire. That's actually what was going on. They were westernizing. So what happened? Now we're seeing the opposite. And I would argue that what happened is you see this move back to Islamification. It really starts in the 50s and 60s. And it's very much a reaction to Western liberalism, I think. Because during the colonial era, you had basically strong, confident Europeans saying this is our way or the highway. Okay, and that's what Muslims respect, okay? Because that's how Muslims themselves behave. Yeah? This is right, you're going to do it, or else. And that's how the Europeans were. Well, these are our laws, these are our ways, we don't care about your Quran, etc., do whatever you want. If anything, that probably embarrassed Muslims, and they were like, yeah, Islam's not serving us anymore. It's not helping us. It was fine when we were doing jihad and winning. Now, what are we getting out of this? So they started, westernizing, for lack of a better word, trying to assimilate and become like their colonizers, who they looked up to as more powerful because they were. So then you go and you enter in the 60s and you start seeing a different change. And what happens in the 60s? Well, the West loses confidence. The West starts hating itself. The West starts condemning itself and criticizing itself. The West starts praising everyone else but itself, including Muslims, and starts talking about how great Islam is and how progressive and how it's more tolerant than the West. All of that works to serve to actually push Muslims back to Islam. Okay, and you see this often in their writings. I've traced this, progression and how it works. And, things like sexual liberation in the West, that's just anathema to Muslims often. It's seen as very corrupt and immoral. Now we have this transgender business. So all this stuff has, coalesced and just really convinced Muslims of one thing. Yeah, the West has technology and we want to replicate, if not appropriate that. Yeah, they have good standards of living and we want that, but we want nothing to do with our culture. We are in no way, shape, or form going to assimilate with them. And if anything, well, we need a culture. Well, we have one. It's Islam. And so Islam is back in a big way. And again, it's a very symbiotic relationship, as I'd been saying earlier, with what's happening in the West itself and how the West itself is feeding this sort of resurgence.
They seem to have co-opted a lot of useful idiots in the West that really don't understand the real Islam. Would you agree with that?
Oh, of course. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the West is its own enemy in this case. It's actively undermining itself. It's putting its enemies on a pedestal. It's just amazing. So of course, yes, there's a lot of useful idiots, and you see this especially with when you see the left or like LGB people being supportive of Muslims. you know, and the Muslims they're not dumb. They'll take it. They'll go with it until such time that well, we don't need your support anymore, and we'll throw you off a roof, which is what we should have done in the first place. Okay, because that's a punishment for homosexuals. It replicates Sodom and Gomorrah. Hitting concrete.
Sorry, are there any unique positives, unique goods that Islam brings to modern civilization? And I'm trying to find things that other religions don't also do. And you may not have an answer to that. It's kind of a curveball. I wanted to, because I can name all the things that worry me about Islam. You've mentioned a whole lot of them. There are a whole lot more that are anathema to the way I want to live my life, and all my friends want to live their life. Hence the suspicion of Islam, the fear, or whatever it's called. But there must be some unique positives or unique goods. I'm hoping there are.
Well, I would argue, and some people will disagree with, the premise of what I'm saying, but it's a very traditional and conservative ideology. It's patriarchal. The tribalism, of course, we speak about it as negative because we're not part of the tribe. But tribalism is pretty good if you're part of the tribe. So it's very cohesive. It looks out for their own members, right? These are things that it'd be nice to see Western people think that way once in a while, right? Look out for their own, instead of being ashamed of that and always trying to help the other, so they can show everyone I'm not racist or whatever. So I think that. But again, like you said, I don't know if it's 100% unique to Islam. These family kinship should be, I think, normal anyway. But yeah, it's very resilient, as you can see, to the crazy form of leftism, wokeism. I don't think wokeism can penetrate Islam. So that's a strength I think it has. Whereas clearly it's penetrated Christianity. It's undermined it to some degree.
And, there was a period of time, I don't know if it still exists, when, there were great scientific and other developments within the world of Islam. They were the leading edge in certain technologies and sciences and things like that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Doesn't strike me to be the case anymore or right now. Have I nailed that or not?
No, well, it never was the case. What people call the golden age of Islam, scientific progress, etc. What they're talking about is a time when, first of all, Islam was still pretty new. Usually, we're talking like the 900, and Islam starts conquering in the late, mid 600s. So they're talking about regions that are ancient, that already had a lot of knowledge, that were already the home of knowledge, and now there's a thin veneer of Islamic rule above them. But the people actually performing and these advances are not Muslims, or they're nominal Muslims. They just converted the other day, so now they change their name because they want to be part of the winning team. They don't want to pay tribute. Okay, so most of them, a great many of them, are Persians. Okay, others are Christians, Jews. These were the people who were doing this. It's the same people who were always doing this. But now, because you have a veneer of Islam on top, the authorities, they call it an Islamic golden age. The fact is, this happened not because of, but rather despite Islam. And we see this because the more Islam becomes ossified, the golden age happened at a time where Islamic law is still not even codified. There's room for liberal interpretations and freedom of thought. But there's this saying where the doors of ijtihad, or essentially like Islamic law, is now codified around the 10th, 11th century, okay, which is after the golden age. And after that, well, you don't see any more scientific progress. So it was never, to start with, part of Islam. It just happened. It's kind of like saying, under the Mongols, under their short-lived empire, there was a lot of great stuff going on. It wasn't because the Mongols invented it, right?
It was average. The average Joe woke up one day and made stuff happen.
Yeah, pyramids of skulls, but you can't call it, the Mongols made a golden age. So it's the same thing, I think.
And Raymond, there were thriving and vibrant Jewish communities in a lot of these countries. When did the Jews start realizing they were not safe anymore or not protected anymore in those communities and started to leave? Because there are very few Jews left in the Arab world.
Well, yeah, I mean, from the start, as I mentioned, the Quran 929, that's the final word on Christians and Jews, which is you have to pay tribute and you have to accept secondary status. The verse literally says you have to feel yourself subdued and humbled. Okay, so that was for Jews as well. But it's interesting because I do recall there was, for example, there were a lot of Jews in Alexandria in Egypt in the early 20th century, early 1900s. But then with the Egyptian revolution, they all fled. As well as in other countries as well, because it was one thing to live in a place like Egypt when you had a strong colonial power, which is to say kind of European influence. But once Arabs and Muslims really took over, it wasn't very good for them. There were also Greeks in Alexandria. Again, this is in the 20th century, not too long ago, who also fled. Now, today, I don't know, there's almost, if you talk about the Middle East, Jews are just basically in Israel because it's not very safe, obviously, to be in any other Muslim Arab country.
So just to talk about Africa very quickly, there's a rapid Islamification of Africa taking place. If you take one country, Burkina Faso, which is northwest Africa, I've actually been there, and the capital, as all of you know, it's very easy, is Ouagadougou. No one seems to know that. Last generation, it was 80% Christian, 20% Muslim. It's now 80% Muslim, 20% Christian. And that Islamification is moving south. Nigeria used to be a relatively fine balance, 50-50 Christians and Muslims. It's now swinging heavily in the Muslims' favor. And it's not just because of the baby jihad. A lot of people are signing up to it. And I think you mentioned a little earlier one of the reasons. It offers a disciplined, committed, helpful family. I don't want to say cult, but maybe I should say cult, where you join and you obey the rules and men are in charge. It's patriarchal, it's tribal. It's like joining a football team. It's like being a football, I was going to say hooligan, that's the wrong word, a football fan, joining the club and you're one of the team. And Christianity doesn't offer that, does it?
Historically, Christianity did offer that, but not the defanged doormat variety that permeates the West today, unfortunately. But to your larger point, I'm very concerned about Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, because it's kind of like a total blind spot for the West. They don't pay any attention to it. And if you really want to talk about carnage and jihadist savagery, it's all there. This is where, I write reports every month since 2011 titled Muslim Persecution of Christians for Gatestone Institute. And by far, sub-Saharan Africa is where every month there's massacres of Christians at the hands of Muslims. Nigeria, of course, tops the list. I think the number, it's something like one Christian every 2 hours on average is killed for being a Christian. But it's also in places that most people don't even recognize: Mozambique, Democratic Republic of Congo, and the ISIS guys there, and they are ISIS, they're actually pledged to them. They go under the name of Allied Democratic Forces. Okay, so the West already has a blind spot, but with them actually using names like that, they'll never get it, of course. And it's just straight up carnage, straight up jihadism. And then the West talks about things like, oh yeah, it's climate change is driving this stuff. It's not it has nothing to do with religion. It's not about Islam. Islam's a religion of peace, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, Africa is when you talk about ISIS and they've been supposedly removed from where they were, Syria and Iraq, well, they're really ensconced in Africa, even more than they were in Syria and Iraq, like really deep embedded in there. And it's just not something that people talk about or discuss. And it's one of those things, it's sort of a myopia. We're not paying attention, but like you say, whether due to demographics or just people joining it keeps growing and growing. And sub-Saharan Africa was more Christian, of course, than Muslim, and now that's reversing. Like you said, in Nigeria, but in other places as well, Burkina Faso. In America, we were taught Black Lives Matter. Okay, one life matters. The whole world rose up because Mr. Floyd was killed while he was on drugs and resisting arrest. But one Christian every 2 hours doesn't count. We don't even talk about that. It's not even worth mentioning. So again, it's the hypocrisy, maybe a little bit of racism too. I don't know, but it's definitely discrimination because of their religious identity.
Look, I believe that the rapid Islamification of Africa is the greatest threat to Africa. I really do. And I think it needs to be noticed. Let me ask you the big question. Is Islam a religion of peace?
I won't give you a very simple yes. I'll give you a good answer, okay? It comes from, it's a linguistic trick. So in Arabic is, words are actually all etymologically related. They're all based on 3 root letters, consonants. And then depending on where you put vowels, you get closely related words, okay? So kataba, KTB, okay, those 3, if I say mektab, I mean desk. If I say katab, I mean wrote. If I say kitab, I mean book. So you see how they're all related. Now, there's the 3 letters, SLM, salama, can, depending on where you put the vowels, you get different meanings. Salam means peace. Islam means submit. Now, how are they connected? Well, by submitting, you get peace. Okay, so the idea is, yes, Islam is a religion of peace once you submit and become a Muslim or become a willing dhimmi and, you know, live as a second-class citizen, etc. If you don't, no, there is no peace.
And why don't moderate Muslims speak up?
I don't even know what that means, what a moderate Muslim is, honestly.
Okay, 2 questions here.
No. I believe I don't believe in moderate Muslims. I believe what you have is secular, cultural, lackadaisical, indifferent Muslims. I think they exist. What is moderate? What is a moderate Muslim? Well, I follow some parts of Allah's commandments, but others, that's extreme. It's not logically satisfying. I could never be a moderate Muslim. I'd either be an apostate or I'd be what they call a radical. I think the better distinction is it's not radical and moderate. It's, are you a pious, observant Muslim, which makes you a radical, or are you a indifferent, apathetic, cultural Muslim, which makes you a moderate? I think that's a more realistic distinction. As to why they don't, speak out, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it could be dangerous to their health, first of all. Why should they? If the West itself is going out of its way to suppress talk about this, why should they speak out, honestly? And the West is telling them, no, your religion is peace. When they speak out, Westerners attack them and say, oh, you're an Islamophobe, to a Muslim. So on the one hand, it doesn't profit them. And of course, it certainly doesn't. It's dangerous from their co-religionists of the more zealous variety. So I think, but there's also a third reason, and we go back to this taqiyya idea, which is those who appear moderates are just waiting for circumstances to change, right? And we saw this actually during the time of ISIS. I remember there were many reports when ISIS was infiltrating and conquering portions of Iraq and Syria, where Christians talked about how Christians who had been living there, for millennia, and they lived in the same villages with Muslims, and they said, yeah, we got along with the Muslims. We actually would help them. We took care of them. They were like family. And then once ISIS came along, they immediately turned and they joined ISIS. They pointed out where the Christians live. And, this is, so that's definitely a real thing. So there's also moderates who are moderate based exclusively on circumstance, which is subject to change.
Has your speaking out been dangerous for your health?
Yeah, I think so. But it's also very invigorating.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, keeps it makes for an exciting life, I suppose. But yeah, it's not. And I'm not trying to make light of it, but what else can I make of it but make light of it? So it is what it is.
But you're coming at it academically. I mean, you're not. You've got justifying everything. You are justifying everything you're saying.
I'm not trying to mock Islam. Maybe there's people who do that, and it's for them. It's fun to just. I'm trying to be as objective as I can. I mean, sometimes I've said positive things about Muslims in a way. I've blamed Westerners. So I just really try to look at it as objectively as I can.
What would your message be of hope for the quiet, average, decent Christian out there? I mean, I like to say, onward Christian soldiers, let's get muscular. Maybe you want to say the same thing.
Yeah. It's wake up. If you want to be a Christian, this is not it. Christianity is not about like that commercial intentionally losing. It's not about intentionally being everyone's doormat, washing everyone's feet. Okay, there's a truth, and if there's anything, if any religion stands for the truth vigorously unto death, it's Christianity. It's really the most masculine in many ways. And you see this historically. I was mentioning one of my books, Defenders of the West. The subtitle is The Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. So you can see in the subtitle, and these were men who, they were very Christian. They were more Christian than many people who claim they're Christian. I mean, they were kings and they were emperors, but if you look at their lifestyle, they were very Christian. But they had no problem reconciling militancy with piety. Okay, so and this goes back to the concept of just war theory, which is of course part of Christianity. It's all over the Bible. Augustine articulated it back in the 4th century. So there's no problem. Christians need to understand that your calling is not just to lay down before everyone. In fact, this version of Christianity, which dominates, I honestly believe it was if not articulated, it's being supported and sponsored by anti-Christian forces. Because who else does it serve? If Christians are powerful and I'm weak and I want to undermine them, what better thing can I do than to convince them to beat themselves, right? By doing nothing and laying down before me or before anyone. So people need to understand that is not Christianity at all. And if they want to read about examples, like I said, they can check out my book, Defenders of the West, or I have another one, The Two Swords of Christ, and that looks at even the more extreme example, which is the military orders. So these were guys who were monks, okay, taking vows of obedience, chastity, poverty, and yet they were like the fiercest warriors around that terrified Muslims. So to us, that's very unintelligible. To us, monks are just somewhere weeping and crying and doing nothing, whereas these guys were actually warriors that terrified the best of the best, and they were still pious and living like monks. So yeah, that is part of the Christian tradition. And I think it's time for Christians to reclaim it.
I had this book. It's my favorite books, and I remember exactly which ones they were. But one of them was about Richard the Lionheart. And the book had wonderful pictures of Richard the Lionheart, and he taking up his sword and his armor and going on the Crusades. I loved it. Richard the Lionheart, to me, he's the Christianity that I admire, the muscular Christianity, the onward Christian soldiers, onwards as to war. So I'm in that camp too. I think we read to regain our strength, take on our armor, and, believe in ourselves again, believe in Christianity again.
Richard the Lionheart, for your information, is chapter 3 of Defenders of the West. So he gets his own full chapter.
I'm going to have to buy that one and read it. I'm going to have to.
I'll leave you the final humorous anecdote now that you brought up Richard. And it's a personal anecdote, but my family, my parents, their names start with R's, my mom and father. And they named all their kids with an R. So I'm the youngest. When it came to me, they did this tradition where they would put R names next to candles, and whichever is lit at the end is the name, and it was Richard. Okay. But then on second thought, I heard this later on. My father said, if we name him Raymond and we end Richard and we end up going back to Egypt, they're going to kill him. And so they gave me the second name, which was Raymond. But the point is, it just shows you that until now, the name Richard is still, it still provokes Muslims in the Middle East.
What a pleasure, Raymond. What a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much. It was fascinating. And, in an hour to go through all of that with a lot of questions unanswered, a lot of things I would love to know. Maybe we can do this again in a month or two. Folks, Raymond Ibrahim.